This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is David Bromwich. David Bromwich is the Sterling Professor of English at Yale. There are a lot of Sterling professors at Yale, but some of them, only some of them, have a capital S Sterling, and he's one of those. He's a profound Yalie because he went there. He was in the class of 1973 and got his PhD at Yale, though his first job was teaching at Princeton, where he spent 11 happy years. That's right. And I tell you a secret, he is neither a conservative nor a Republican. I think this is correct. But two of his favorite writers or authors are Edmund Burke and Abraham Lincoln. And today he's going to talk about Edmund Burke. He's written books before on William Hazlitt and on Wordsworth, so much of his scholarly work is in English poetry. And he also wrote a book on universities called Politics by Other Means, a wonderful book. And he's recently published the first volume of an intellectual biography of Edmund Burke called The Intellectual Life of Edmund Burke, From the Sublime and Beautiful to American Independence. And he's, I think, going to talk today about that book in its second volume. And the title is The Consistency of Edmund Burke, Are There Burkean Principles? So, David Bromwich.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and to be here with Harvey Mansfield as host, because he's been a real encourager of my work, especially on Burke, as he has been for many others. And actually, my talk will not be about the second volume of the biography of Burke, or rather the interpretation with life in it that I'm writing. But it won't be summarizing anything in the first volume either. I just thought it would be interesting to try and address the name of a possibly useful good for political thought that Burke is not ordinarily associated with, and connected with the word principles. And then the other supposed good quality in a politician or statesman, which is often denied to Burke, consistency, and try to put them together to see if there's some way in which we can say, though Burke did contradict himself, though there isn't perfect consonance between what he says against the French Revolution and what he had said for the American colonists, and though he never admitted the contradictions and could never believe he had been wrong about anything, and those we must hold to be venial defects of character, I think the consistency is there, and I think the principles are possible to characterize, isolate, if one doesn't emphasize them too much. So I took a hint from reading Harvey Mansfield's essay on Machiavelli and Burke and Principles, published in 1967, and there's I think, reliable guidance there. So I'm going to pull out a couple of indications from that essay and see what more might be made of them. And I'll read some passages too, because I like to read Burke out loud, and I think it often puts his ideas as well as his words in people's ear and mind, and is good for discussion. So first, let's call it principle. And it is negative, as many of Burke's are. But there is no original need for sovereignty. So political theories spun out on the basis of a mental exercise regarding the state of nature. Contractual theories of the social compact, are more burdensome than helpful to persons actually wanting to engage in the work of government, or even to work out the new stages of a government. Burke is opposed to all innovation in government, all beginning from the beginnings. There is that sentence in Reflections on the Revolution in France. The very idea of the fabrication of a new government is enough to fill us with disgust and horror. And this idea is still with us, and it crosses political lines. The idea that you can fabricate a government. I think, for example, to make a contemporary connection, the idea that liberal Democrats in the U.S. are fond of social programs that don't have any relation to the previous habits of the people they're attempted to be imposed on is there. General McChrystal, when he was head of CENTCOM, said about our venture in Afghanistan that we are giving the people a government in a box. Right? A government in a box. That's the fabrication of a new government that filled Burke with disgust and horror. So that's a principle. And with it goes, and you all know this, it's the most familiar thing about Burke, his giving priority to society over the state. He works out his commentaries on politics, his specific proposals for legislation, from what he can learn of a given society. Societies are different from each other, but there's a great deal of continuity between them. He is a believer in human nature, not a single, unified, essentialized human nature, but habits, tendencies, patterns of vice and virtue that go across cultures. Within a given society, you can observe how people have done things, how things have been done well and ill, and it is society that is your instructor, not ideas about the state that could ever come in advance of that. So call that the first principle. The second, and again, I like very much Mansfield's formulation of it in that early essay of his. Burke is predisposed against innovation, and that goes with a complex thought of his about the innovators being men of action, energy, virtue, in the Machiavellian sense, men who want to be great, maybe already are, and want to heighten their greatness. The instinct, to call it that, the impulse, the energy for innovation comes from such persons, but the disposition of the people is conservative. And Burke does have that in common with Machiavelli of the Discourses, that it is the nature of the people to want not to be oppressed, not to be commanded. It is the nature of the grandees to want to command, to want to oppress. Burke is not on the side of the singular, innovative, prince-like inventor or innovator in society, but nor does he hold out any preconceived notions about the good of the people, which he supposes the people would share. The people want not to be disturbed too much in their ways of life. They want to live a decent life, to get along, not to be imposed on. They are creatures of habit, much more than men of genius, generals, politicians of a leading sort tend to be. So politics isn't for them. That's one of the, shall we call it, anthropological observations behind Burke's huge prejudice against democracy. You're giving the people what they don't want, but they should be allowed to be happy, wealthy, and at peace. And it is the work of government to assure that. Government is a contrivance of human wisdom to provide for human wants. Good sentence there in the Reflections, and it is a refutation by anticipation against a lot of ways of simplifying Burke that we're all used to. It's a human contrivance, not given to us by God. to provide for human wants, and the wants include those of the people. But that doesn't mean the people are the best judges of their own wants. What are they the best judges of? The best judges of infringement on their decent lives, on their wish to preserve a certain modicum of peace and prosperity. When you assault them, when you transgress against their sense of what's owing to their minimal dignity, you'll hear it from them. So again, that's negative. This belief that the people are conservative, and that shouldn't be tampered with by men of energy who themselves should not be allowed to do too much. Third, and I'm taking this word from Mansfield, and I think the whole phrase, in fact, legality is the true method for change. Profound belief in law and in the inviolability of law, in the importance of not making exceptions. It's this, I suppose, that goes a long way to explain his two-part strategy for the reform of the British government of India, which was, as he said, the government of the British East India Company, a state in the disguise of a merchant. The disguise should be taken away. The government of India should be made regular. Whether it must therefore be completely non-commercial in the end, Burke does not tell us. But it should be made intelligible by oversight and checks, both of which he believes in, without necessarily urging the last possible degree of transparency. But there are rival interests between oversight and the men interested in profit who will be running the trading empire in India. And that should be dealt with if there's going to be justice and equity in British policy there. The fourth and most, I think, maxim-like of Burke's principles is that one must not be the judge in one's own cause. It goes with his commitment to legality. Why? He says it a couple times. He says it almost in that sentence. It is to be the judge. The very idea of being the judge in my own cause is a thing that frightens me. He says it in his speech on conciliation with the colonies, and he says it again against the aggrandizement of the Third Estate in the French Revolution. He says it against the revolutionists in France. No one is good enough to be his own judge, and it follows for Burke, I think, though this is in some tension with his optimistic and even visionary hope for the British Empire or the British Commonwealth, there is no country that is good enough to be the judge in its own cause. He spoke of the impeachment of Hastings as giving justice to the people of India in the eyes of Europe. There speaks law, and there speaks giving the judgment to someone not quite yourself if your own judgment is being overseen by witnesses whom you must impress as being just. I think it could be asked, and I'm going off on a small digression here, but we can pursue it afterward. If you can't be the judge in your own cause, what becomes of empire? And I think the answer to that in Burke is very difficult to tease out. He is attracted to, understands, is praised by Adam Smith for understanding the theory of free trade and the wealth of nations, which Burke called the most important, that's the adjective, the most important book perhaps ever written. But I don't think he shares the the depth, the persistence of Smith's hope that free trade will solve the contradiction between the instincts that trade works from, of commerce and of profit and of buying at the cheapest price and selling at the dearest, the contradiction between that and a imperial dealing with a subordinate people. But he doesn't go into detail, I think, about his reservations. They have to be picked out of the long stretch of days he conducted with himself as manager of those issues, in the opening, the closing, and the sixth charge of the Hastings impeachment. Okay. Let me make an annex to the principle of innovation being the thing most antithetical to prudent and just government. This goes with the peculiar definition Burke gives to a party and what it is that's good about the existence of parties and about party government. The word he favors even more than party is association, and he defines party itself as an association of men who agree on 9 things out of 10 and are willing to sacrifice the 10th for the good of showing that they're capable of consistency, they're capable of the non-moral but implicitly good for morality virtue of loyalty. And consistency, of course, goes with the habit of acting in a party. What's the contrasting term to party then, as an association of men united in a cause for the improvement of their country, but also for their own fame and for their own the use of their energies. The opposite term, I think, is what he calls individuality, usually with a negative emphasis. The dust and powder of individuality is the contemptuous description of it in his writing on France. But this this advocacy of party, to call it that, I think works out again negatively more than as an endorsement of a certain kind of clearly defined government. In Burke, he is in that sense offering a refinement and simplification of Machiavelli's defensive party. And in Burke, party, as you read through his works and go back over them, I think comes to be strangely almost synonymous with the idea of opposition. Not a permitted opposition, but constant opposition on the scene where governments are making laws. So that in this regard, you might look at Burke as the oddly connecting link between Machiavelli and Mill. And I'm guessing nobody thought Mill would be the last name in that group. But there is the sense that a society can settle into something too inert, too dead, to be worthy of what's best and possible in human nature. All 3 of them, Machiavelli, Burke, and Mill, share that distinction. But it's the idea of an opposition which you might say itself serves as a check that Burke hands forward to Mill, and Mill takes on without much optimistic or ameliorative talk about party. Okay. So, I mean, how does this help account for not only Burke's defense of party and argument for advancing the fortunes of his own party in thoughts on the present discontents, but also his attack, his whole-length attack on the first strong impulses toward what he thought would be total democracy in the French Revolution. What Burke thought he could discern in the Jacobins was a party without opposition, and this in spite of the fact that there are nothing but factions, nothing but conflict, nothing but anarchy is another of his words for the vice related to the French Revolution. And yet, the men of energy, the men of talent who, emerge from the doors of the Cordeliers or the Jacobin Club into the assembly and then start planning the actions in the streets, perhaps contriving a bread shortage so that the people could be seen to have backed them all along. These men share a certain psychology of action and government. They have a great deal in common, and most of all, they are intolerant of let's call it, rooted or principled opposition. The only opposition you see is the rather, from Burke's point of view, weak, moderate, prudential, cushioning, buffering opposition of a man like Lafayette. I think he is cruel toward Lafayette in everything he says about him everywhere. Burke misunderstood Lafayette, but nevertheless, that's the place he holds in Burke's various accounts of the Revolution, a moderate who stands for nothing, whereas the party, the interest, the dynamism of the French Revolution comes from a kind of men who are new in government in France and who are, as it were, homogeneous. They're a party of one kind of men. He also saw this in India, in the British young men who came back to be possessors of great fortunes and married into aristocratic families. And it's this that leads him to say, a strange remark that comes out, I think, once in a letter and once in one of his lesser writings in the 90s, that the two great evils of our time are Jacobinism and Indianism. And by Indianism, Burke will mean the pattern of exploiting a monopoly on trade for profit, for an extractionist policy of bringing home the profits, followed by ascent to greater heights of power and influence within England. Heights of power, influence on which there is no check. He thought Paul Benfield, one of the India men, owned 8 votes in the House of Commons. That was already a lot. He didn't want to see power like that become greater. So it is a clue, I think, to, and there's a great article on this by Regina Janes on Burke's flighting leap, as she calls it, from India to France. But there's strong rhetorical and links of moral analysis, too, between what he finds wrong in the exploitation of that subcontinent by the British East India Company, let to do it by the House of Commons, and what's happening in France. If he hadn't been so engaged in investigating the abuses of power in India throughout the 1780s, he would not have written against the French Revolution as he did. I'm convinced of that, and that will be in my second volume. It's one of the, without which not, it's one of the necessary conditions, I think, for the extent of Burke's hostility toward the French Revolution. He thought it was happening in more than one place. And I think this is also a, what do we say, subtextual motive for the title of his book. People even then were calling it the French Revolution. Well, it's delivered ostensibly as a response, quite an overblown response to the sermon on love of our country by Richard Price, which had been scheduled to be given at the Old Jewry in 1788, deferred a year. So on the 100th anniversary celebration of the Society for the Commemoration of the Revolution in England, Price gives that address, 1789, and Burke responds to it in the Reflections. So there you've got the formula, the revolution in England, the revolution in France. But I think what was preying on Burke's mind, haunting him, was the idea that it is a revolution in France now, but it could be happening in more than France. It could be happening across Europe, and of course, once they declare war in the Netherlands, it starts to happen. And Burke, as many people are proud of him for doing, prophesies someone like Napoleon. It's not, I think, the most impressive single stroke of genius in Burke, but if you like that sort of thing, it's there. But he also, he had seen a man on horseback in India. He had seen Warren Hastings governing with, as Burke says, arbitrary power which does not exist, because you can't go on ruling a people like that. Democracy. Democracy and aristocracy. Let me make these points just with a quotation each, and then I'll stop. The trouble with democracy is not only that Burke believes it is the tide of democracy is strong, it is becoming greater, and it will be impossible to reverse. People won't be reasonable about the number of walks of life into which they want to extend democracy. And on that point, I agree with Burke, and I am on that point a conservative myself. That is, democracy is something about politics which has its advantages and disadvantages, but if you try to put it everywhere, it is the disadvantages that become prominent and hard to resist. The radical political injustice, Burke believed, of democracy was that it tended to make the people the judges in their own cause. A king can't be the judge in his own cause. A country can't be the judge in its own cause over another country, ideally, and nor can the people. And, therein lies the motive driving a famous passage in the Reflections, where Burke says of popular authority, of the people, they are themselves in a great measure their own instruments. They are nearer to their objects when they get closer to governing. Besides, they are less under responsibility to one of the greatest controlling powers on earth, the sense of fame and estimation. And that, remember, has been his charge about the fault in the admission into the French Assembly of so many persons of inferior status. Burke talks like an aristocrat when he talks against inferior status. The poorly adapted character of a tallow chandler or a friseur, a hairdresser, to the job of being a member of the assembly. And that passage where he says about the list of the elected members of the tiers-état, as soon as I saw that list, I knew pretty much what was going to follow. You have here nothing but the small-time attorneys, the fomenters of the petty wars of village vexation and so on. He would have seen Robespierre, a provincial prosecutor, as an example of that. So, in contrast, the good thing about an aristocrat is that he has a previous fortune and character at stake. He has an idea of fame that's proper to him, and that's something he doesn't want to lose. He's not just greedy because he's already got it. He is to a degree inert and moderate in his energy. And Burke liked to associate metaphors of mediocrity and inertia with the aristocracy, understanding that someone like him, a man of energy, was unusual. There should be space for them, but not too much, not too many Burkes. And that is part of his theory. It's not just selfish or self-exalting. So going on with that passage on the people and what's wrong with making a government by the people, the share of infamy that is likely to fall to the lot of each individual in public acts is small indeed, the operation of opinion being in the inverse ratio to the number of those who abuse power. Their own approbation of their own acts has to them the appearance of a public judgment in their favor. I think of how many people, I've never I think I've never been part of a poll that had any significance in this country in all my years of life. But think of the feeling of people who have come up with a selfish, stupid opinion on which they pretty well suspected that they were only half informed and that they might be wrong. And then they see the poll come out and 64% are on their side, and they have the approbation of their own acts that Burke is speaking of. Then elevate that into a system without checks, which is improvising new forms of justice, as the French Revolution did, and you see the danger. It has to them the appearance of a public judgment in their favor. A perfect democracy is therefore the most shameless thing in the world. As it is the most shameless, it is also the most fearless. He wants government not to be fearless. And the importance of law, checks, and so on comes in there. Finally, the reason for his, though he is a complete, almost to a unnerving, surprising, unnecessary degree, he is a defender of aristocratic society. But why Burke is not at all programmatically or sentimentally or prudentially or cynically a defender of oligarchy called by that name, or of the character type of the strong-minded aristocrat who goes all the way in his push for power. And again, I'll try this with contrast against Machiavelli. It is for Machiavelli good to be proud, so long as you are also jealous. That's the quality of the prince. Burke is always saying, on the contrary, that aristocrats who have high status must not be proud, and the people who have humble status must not be jealous. You get a society at peace out of that, and if it's a mixed constitutional society, it will be a society that has checks against injustice. You get an aphorism out of that thought, such as, kings will be tyrants from policy when people are rebels from principle. So principle has its limits. You don't want to take it all the way into something that justifies jealousy, something that justifies perpetual conflict. Society wants to be at rest, and yet Burke knows that it also should be susceptible of improvement, and he takes his stand most of all as a reformer. That's the word he wants to be used for himself. What comes from having a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve. Do I have time for reading out 2 minutes worth?
Yeah.
From the Letter to a Noble Lord, just because I thought of it again this morning, and as the jazz players say, I think you might like it. This is about conflict of status, and Burke is engaging in it as he preaches against it. He's dealing with a proud aristocrat, the Duke of Bedford, who has denied the rightness, the appropriateness, the deserving of the pension Burke was awarded by the younger Pitt and King George III. And Burke then decides to go into the genealogy of the aristocratic title of the Duke of Bedford, an old non-aristocrat digging up the dirt on the young aristocrat. And here comes the lesson in manners as part of morale and morality and essential to the fabric of politics, about which I've said nothing. It's the thing I think people most connect with Burke's originality. But here he's doing it with that view of not being the judge in your own cause and not being the pride that is the spur for jealousy either. Why will his grace, by attacking me, force me reluctantly to compare my little merit with that which obtained from the crown those prodigies of profuse donation by which he tramples on the mediocrity of humble and laborious individuals? That's Burke, humble and laborious. So he excavates the layers of the fortune that has no longer much connection with real character of the young Duke of Bedford. You come from a certain house. The first peer of the name, the first purchaser of the grants, was a Mr. Russell, a person of an ancient gentleman's family, raised by being a minion of Henry VIII. As there generally is some resemblance of character to create these relations, the favorite was in all likelihood much such another as the master. And Burke goes on to specify the grants they're generous but not enormous, not exorbitant, that he has received from the crown so late in life, and the grants that the originator of the Bedford name received from Henry VIII, contrasting the two. Mine was from a mild and benevolent sovereign, his from Henry VIII. He just repeats the name. Mine had not its fund in the murder of any innocent person of illustrious rank, or in the pillage of any body of unoffending men. His grants were from the aggregate and consolidated funds of judgments iniquitously legal, and from possessions voluntarily surrendered by the lawful proprietors with the gibbet at their door. All the packed irony of the, the regulated hatred of those sentences. And he concludes, I'm skipping some great paragraphs, with a plea, a sort of ironic prayer that this person not infuse political dealings in Britain at this time of revolution with a spirit of jealousy and vicious pride, and that he thereby cultivate manners such as will allow Britain to remain a society at peace as France is not. He will pardon me. He is a little mistaken when Bedford says that only Henry VIII is capable of judging merit. All discernment did not lose its vision when his creator closed his eyes. Let him, and we were talking a little last night about Burke and Swift. Here is Burke doing Swift of The Tale of a Tub. Let him remit his rigor on the disproportion between merit and reward in others, and they will make no inquiry into the origin of his fortune. They will regard with much more satisfaction, as he will contemplate with infinitely more advantage, whatever in his pedigree has been dulcified by an exposure to the influence of heaven in a long flow of generations from the hard, acidulous, metallic texture of the spring. So, in your case, young Bedford, it's just money. In my case, it's some principle of generous law-giving, law-making for my society, with very little benefit for myself until now, my old age, when it's almost too late for me to enjoy it. So he makes the essay as personal as possible, not only in apology, self-defense, but also in attack, and by that gives an example, I think, of what his version of a society at peace would be. He here acts outside the law, but within the laws of controversy, as the opposition, as the check against the greed and the monstrous pride of a man like Bedford. He is making, as it were, the personal political and vice versa without trivializing either. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much. Now, questions? Yeah.
A week ago, I was in Dublin, and in front of Trinity College, there's a statue of Burke. And of course, at least this time in the 1780s and 90s, there was a fair amount of foment in Ireland with respect to, I think, wanting to replicate the American Revolution. And as far as I can tell, Burke's attitude towards that was seems to me a little confusing.
Towards Ireland.
Towards Ireland,
Yes.
right, in terms of Ireland's, he seemed to be sympathetic to the Catholics who at that point were subject to fairly stringent laws, but he also seemed to oppose the independence of Ireland. In any event, my question is, in terms of what you have described as the principles of Burke, how do you think his position towards Ireland fit into that?
It's one of the more ambiguous and less satisfying moments of engagement, prolonged moments of engagement in his career. And you have the facts right. He worked to achieve free trade of woolens and other things between Ireland and England, to grant them some of the rights that the Americans had been denied, that led to the grievance that led to the break from America. And of course, it's happening at the same time. He doesn't want Ireland to become dangerously moving towards independence at the same time. But he isn't an admirer of the separationists and doesn't ever join their cause or come close to it. What he strangely does, and it is contradictory in itself, is in the 90s sent his son Richard, as it were, to run interference for him with the Catholic Committee and those who are seeking the repeal of Catholic disabilities, that part of radical reform of British policy there. Burke supports through his son, but there's correspondence within English government that Burke conducts for that too. At the same time, he writes the 2 letters to Hercules Languish and one to his son Richard, both of which, or all 3 of which, contain extraordinarily vehement enunciation of British rule over Ireland, and have many phrases, including one famous long paragraph, suggesting that the system has become so corrupt and rotten that it deserves to crumble of its own weight. Now, there's a metaphor that seems to have a meaning, but Burke doesn't want to be answerable for it. Does he mean that Ireland is ripe for a revolution and the revolution should happen? I think to the extent that he is in charge of his motives, he wants to put fear into the minds of the governors of England and make them execute reforms more efficiently. But as often happens with Burke, there is a disproportion between, well, a literary critic of a couple generations before mine, Ivor Winters, called it motive and emotion. If the motive is reform of Ireland on the peaceable terms that would hold it within the empire, the emotion goes so much in excess of it that it's hard to hold them together in solution. But I think that's much. That's how it adds up for Burke's dealings. He had also written in the 1860s, but not published in his lifetime, a legal advisory document that tracts on the popery laws, which was for reform of the laws prejudicial against Catholic inheritance, Catholics being able to conduct their own schools, and so forth. So he is a defender of equality of civil rights for the Irish Catholics, and of something approaching equal rights within the empire of trading and so on, such as the Americans felt they were denied. But he is an idealist of the empire, and he refers to himself in this. I talk about it a little in my interpretation of his September 1780 speech to the electors in Bristol. He refers to himself, he goes through it. He says, I felt as an American in this engagement, I felt as an Irishman in this engagement, I felt as an Englishman in this engagement, but he says, in effect, I am British. And he almost invents this, I mean, as much as anyone, I think, Burke invents the modern, we can call it that, idea of that there's something that is British that shouldn't be parochially any of those other things. And of course, you extend it to Churchill's idea of the British Commonwealth, which is itself a big borrowing from Burke, and you have an image of something that exists for the benefit of humanity at large, potentially, It's a network of relations, of voluntary associations, and all the rest. And I think Burke did have that idealism in him. He's not able very well to specify what it would mean to reduce it to a practice.
I have a question on principles, Burkean principles. In his definition of a political party, which I can't remember exactly, though I definitely should.
I'm not going to give it to you either. I don't have it.
An association of members united on some principle.
Yeah.
So that's a crucial phrase, some principle. And that implies that there can be more than one principle.
And more than one party.
Yeah, and more than one party. And that must mean that the some principle is not necessarily a true principle, of which there could be just one. Or
I think you're bringing.
I
don't think that's like a philosopher's question, but I don't think Burke wants a philosopher's question.
Yeah, all right.
I mean, he really thinks that the principle is a just one, but that it has been chosen among others. Yeah.
Okay. But still, these parties would be opposing parties, so
Yes.
they wouldn't be...
And there is also the relaxed implication that the same party might choose a different principle and gradually cease to emphasize this one and emphasize that one instead.
Right.
Yeah.
So isn't that, in a way, the ancestor to the way in which people speak of principles today in politics, especially when they use the adjective principled? And that means some kind of consistency.
Yeah. Okay.
As opposed to...
I wish I heard even the adjective more often. I don't.
You don't hear that in the English department?
Do you hear it on the
Yeah.
Daily News? I mean, I don't think I hear it.
Yes, I hear it, especially this conservative talk that I sometimes open myself to.
I'm sure.
And there are these.
Well, I mean,
there's these opportunistic. It's what is opposed to opportunism.
I see. I see.
And so you've got a principle, and that means you're pig-headed, or stubborn, or. But also moral.
I would have said, in common usage, I think people, we've seen. No, I'm going to be very good at this. Well, look. The presidents of the last 4 or 5 administrations have been, to a great extent, practical-minded. They generally are. But this continues to go with, asseverations of what can only be called principle, because they say, I won't back down from this.
Right.
That turns out to crumble under pressure. I mean, the current president, Obama, is maybe the largest single example of that because of the number of commitments he made that were unconditional commitments. And he spoke words in advance for doing a thing rather than words afterwards describing the thing he had done. A good pragmatist would do the latter. I suppose you would say a good politician of principle would do all three: say it, do it, and then explain it in terms that make coherence between them. But we've seen very little of it, and I think that's why I'm guessing the conservatives you are hearing the adjective from are people who regard themselves as shut out from the right degree of power. They are in the wilderness, but they deserve to have power, and they deserve it because they have the right ideas. And I think, talk about principle comes in a most lively way to persons in that situation. And Burke, in fact, is aware of that and talks about it, interestingly, how to say, everywhere. What I was going to say is, an example of that kind of party out of power is Bolingbroke. Mm-hmm. And Bolingbroke is full of chatter about principles, the cant of principles. Yes. But I don't think that Burke himself resists the word or the idea. So let me, under your question, try to define it a little more sharply. I don't mean a Kantian principle. I don't mean something that's opposed to practicality, but a cause involved with justice, political, social, and human justice, that you think deserves the maximum emphasis at a given time, and which you will do all you can to advance and all you can to frustrate the opponents of while you have power. And when you're out of power, too, it won't change. The party doesn't change its principle when it's out of power. So, I mean, within Burke's career, the obvious example for the 70s and earliest 1780s would be that there's a disproportion within the Constitution now between the Crown and Parliament. The first two Georges had seemed to go towards an understanding that the House of Commons was sovereign. George III had ideas, perhaps indirectly derived from Bolingbroke, that contradicted that and was trying to engross far more power to the Crown now. And Burke's party is associated on the principle that the House of Commons should regain, that's how they would have put it, the power that was now in jeopardy. Now, historians Namier and many others have called into question, Ian Christie, others, the correctness of this diagnosis. But I am convinced, from reading not only Burke and his friends, but reading Herbert Butterfield and other historians who were on that side, my side, that it was a very intelligent and understandable response to the circumstances they found themselves in. So the principle was to limit the power of the Crown, to limit the executive. And that may not be big enough to count as a high moral principle. It may not be metaphysical enough to fit one's expectations of Kantian principle, but it'll do. And I don't think it goes against our sense of the common usage of English words. And Burke does use the word principle quite a lot. Theory is a word he'll never use favorably, but he in fact is not opposed to abstract general maxim-like thoughts, and he says that in other places. So it's wrong also to think of him as a deep opponent of theory. He is what to say, distrustful of and rather disdainful of people he thinks get so absorbed in their theories that they don't have eyes and ears anymore, and that would be the, so to speak, academic philosophers of politics of his time. But he general thoughts, general maxims guiding conduct, I think Burke is as rich in as anybody of his time. So.
One more question then.
Yeah,
What about the phrase natural law, which you haven't mentioned?
Yeah.
And which was picked up by admirers of Burke on the conservative side, like Russell Kirk,
Yeah.
Peter Stanlis.
Yes.
This is in the 1950s.
Yes, it's a major, and
and he does actually speak of
Yep.
natural law, and he seems to use it especially in speaking of countries which are, so to speak, outside Britain, like India and Ireland.
Yeah,
When he's talking about them.
that's right.
And
When he writes against geographical morality, as he
Yeah.
calls it, and says that we're not like those insects that when they go below the equator, they die. Moral principles aren't like that. And he writes against arbitrary power as a universal negative principle. There is no such thing. We must never act as if there could be an arbitrary power. And that seems to link him to the theorists, to the philosophers of natural law, to Aquinas and others. I've never wanted to make him work out consistently on that. Why? Burke uses actually the word rights until the Reflections on the Revolution in France. He uses the word rights rather freely, unsystematically, but as a positive thing. And law always positively. Natural law, which he can have gotten from Grotius, Vattel, others, whom he alludes to. I don't think he has a worked out understanding of, but it's important to him. You get, I think, more symptomatically, more revealingly, near the start of the East India speech of 1783, a phrase like the natural equality of mankind at large. And what follows from the natural equality of mankind at large. It's very Burkean, what follows and what doesn't follow from it. If I can find it without much searching, and if I can't, never mind. The sense of his deduction from the fact that men at the start are equal, and that's as close as Burke gets to the state of nature. But we all think intuitively that we know when we see another human being. We know that, and Burke is anti-slavery, and knows when he sees a black man that he's seeing a man. And when he gives his speech in favor of Wilberforce's Abolition Act, 1789, Burke says, if I were asked to define a slave, I would call him a degraded man. Well, that's it. There is such a thing as a person, a man. They have rights. But you don't go into specifying them too much. His only serious explanation near the start of that speech is to say that since naturally there is equality, but we understand that that equality does not persist in the various forms of society we see, we should lay down this self-guiding injunction. Any artificial arrangement we make on behalf of people whom we govern should be for their benefit. We are the lawmakers and the governors for the benefit of the people. That's it. And of course, the East India Company, that's his tightest point against Hastings, is that Hastings says again and again and again in his testimonies and documents and depositions, my job was to bring profits to the company. First the company, then England, and then third and last most, and lagging far behind, the people of India. The people of India are hardly even to be considered. And Burke turns it upside down, and that's the radicalism of his proposal for two commissions to govern, to oversee the activities of the company. You are governing. Yes, the situation of man is the preceptor of his duties, and we don't mean to give up these lands, this empire in India, but it is for the benefit of the people of India first, and if that's consistent with what you want to do for your profits, okay. And if not, that's where Burke stops, because his reasoning really does stop there. If not, he doesn't know what to do, as perhaps neither did Adam Smith. But Adam Smith, whose skepticism, whose deep-going critique of the East India Company and the wealth of nations runs very much parallel to Burke. Smith also, I think, throws up his hands if you ask him at that point, but he's more confident that the situation will solve itself once you get rid of monopoly and middlemen.
Apropos of General McChrystal in Afghanistan, another general, Douglas MacArthur, gave Japan a system in a box. He even wrote the Constitution in 1945. Apart from keeping the emperor system, which would have pleased Edmund Burke, it was a new creation. And in fact, government in a box has often been created in our time, multiple times. And what's the issue
Give me
here?
three more, just so I don't have historical knowledge.
The 7 Australian colonies in 1901, they were British colonies. They wrote a constitution for a nation called Australia. And most of them were British born, actually, the people who wrote that constitution. And
they knew the language of the people they were speaking to.
that's true. Some of these cases are foreigners doing it, as MacArthur. Our former colleague here, Carl Friedrich, used to tell us that he helped to write the West German Constitution, and he was an American citizen at the time. But perhaps the issue is, what are the arrangements made for the evolution of things after the box is unpacked?
No, I think the Burkean answer would be, I shouldn't take his phrase and my satire against McChrystal to mean that it's never possible to work out a form of government that proves to be lasting and agreeable to the people who are governed, it's never possible to have that done anew after the old government completely breaks down. One shouldn't say that that's never possible. It all depends on the details of circumstances, the commitment, the knowledge of the local culture, the connections you make with the people there. So the difference between what General MacArthur was able to do and General McChrystal wasn't able to do hangs on the absolute abject defeat of Japan in the war and the fact that the government had to be constructed by something from outside if it was not going to be the shambles, the detritus of the old disposed of imperial system of Japan. So MacArthur and the Americans did what they could. They worked with a lot of people who had linguistic ability and with a lot of people connected in Japan, and it worked out well. But that's the situation of a totally conquered country, different from what our dealings have been with the warlords of Afghanistan in a prolonged guerrilla war, which may be just the last episode of a very much more prolonged one. The Australian case is still a third one, right? Americans in Afghanistan don't speak the language. I don't think one, even if you take the officers from major on up, I don't think 1 in 200 of them spoke the language. But in Australia, with people outside Australia still drawing up the Commonwealth document, the legislation that gives the law to the people, you have a great deal in common to begin with. So I don't mean to turn that Burkean expression of horror, right, at the fabrication of a new government. I shouldn't turn that into a shibboleth. There is such a thing as a government that can only be called new, and sometimes it can work, but it's not a present in a cereal box dealt out by soldiers who don't speak the language, can't even read the directions on the box.
Well, what would Burke have done in Tokyo in 1945?
I can't. I as a teacher, I'm in principle against answering that kind of question. Students are always asking, what would Lincoln have done?
Could I ask, picking up on the pairing of Jacobinism and Indianism, I'm just reminded, I got in the mail yesterday Amitav Ghosh's third novel on the Opium Wars, a series in which he makes a kind of endless, I'm not even maybe beyond his intention, a parallelism between opium in 1840, say, and oil in the George Bush wars. These commodity wars, in a kind of crazed extension of free trade theory in the British Empire and in our day. He doesn't write much about Burke or Burke's caution. Both of these things happen, well after Burke's cautions. But you and I have spoken about this before. I'm sort of endlessly hungry to hear Burke's address to our own present day imperial embarrassment, overextension, imperial remorse. How would he be warning us in retrospect?
Burke is an instructor in remorse for the British. We Americans don't have one yet. I think it's, of course, Burke didn't succeed. Hastings was acquitted on all charges. Perhaps he could be supposed to have enjoyed a longer-term posthumous success in that British education and British government in India in the 19th century profited from the inquest Burke had sponsored, had undertaken, and that it became not a settler colony, but a colony whose governors took a much more lively and particular, and I think the okay academic word would be embedded, interest in the people they were governing. Now, I mean, that too has its own complexity and contradictions. You get an attempt by Fitzjames Stephen to mix the customs of Indian law with the justice and equity of British law, writing a code for them, which they didn't properly have at the time of Sir Elijah Impey's coming in as head of that court and his impeachment. And the Fitzjames Stephen idea is permeated by utilitarian preconceptions, because that's where he came from, an imperialist and a utilitarian. But one of the paradoxes, it's an insight of Burke's criticism of the British conduct of the empire in India in '83, is that he actually seems to praise the previous invaders, Tamburlaine and the Hindu kings and warlords who were there before. I mean, all the previous settlers are praised at the expense of the British, who haven't settled. And the suggestion is, if you cast your lot with the people, perhaps you will build stately monuments on their behalf, just because you want to be part of the reflected glory of those buildings. Again, think about the British in the 19th century. More of that was done. People have a hard time remembering, I have a hard time remembering, the British Empire in India was very young when Burke started his prosecution. He started planning it as early as 1781-82. The attempt at law giving is 1783. The impeachment starts in 1788. But it really dates from Plassey, from Clive's victory, 1757. The empire was then, as Burke began, 16 years old. Is that right? It's 57, 67, 77, no, 26 years old. But it's still young. They haven't been there long enough to get set in their ways, really, but their ways have been careless, predatory, and destructive. And Burke wants them to settle into ways that are law-like, checked, and a benefit to those who are governed. I mean, I think that America is not going to have any settler colonies in the areas where we engage in wars. Right now, North Africa, Southwest Asia, the whole situation is different, and so I better not get into another version of what would Burke have done, because we're in the middle of, there is a religious war. It's called a sectarian war, a religious war going on within Islam right now. The U.S., because of its stature in the world and patterns of U.S. policy making, feels that it should be part of this in some way. And the knowledge that ought to inform how should you be part of it and how not just doesn't seem to be there. We have a party of persons who think we should be involved to the maximum everywhere, and a party who pretty much think, let's stand back and stay out. But I think it's very hard to formulate. The more local knowledge you have, the better. And we don't have much. And I don't know of almost any case, gets us back to Japan and Germany post-war. It's very hard to think of a case of an imperial power that has been able to undergo the self-examination you're thinking would be desirable without being defeated, in a significant way. And as an American, I don't actually wish for that. But what we have, so long as we consider ourselves successful, is never going to be, in Burkean terms, answerable.
George, our friend George, he's something of an instructor in remorse.
I came in late, so forgive me if you've already answered this question. But a few moments ago, answering another question from this area, you said that Burke did recognize natural equality, but stipulated that wherever inequality had been introduced into society, it had to be for the benefit of those.
The word is artificial. Since we make the natural equality of mankind into an artificial arrangement, all real societies are artificial. The end of government should be the benefit of the people governed. Yeah.
Yes, and it sounds very well, and it's virtually the universal justification offered for inequality. But who decides? Why aren't those governed entitled to decide for themselves whether their interest is being served? Isn't this, in effect, the question that Paine asked Burke so insistently, and that no Burkean, as far as I'm concerned, has ever satisfactorily answered?
I'm with you and with Paine on democracy as a whole more than I'm with Burke. And I think the central objection to Burke's hostility against the very idea of democracy, the objection to him is that there's much more importance than he assigns to the people being able to give the alarm, being able to say when they've been imposed on, when they've been infringed on, and even the people's almost physical testimony, freedom to testify to what they consider abuses, and what they consider, and then more positively, their ideas, however vague, of what would be to their welfare and what not. If you're governing for the, if you take that part of Burke seriously, and in his India speech he surely does, then within the terms of that speech, your case against democracy can't be ultimately as strong as the case for it. But nevertheless, I think his what should we call it? His elite suspicion that there will never be very many people who are able to judge what works well and what works for the long term for most of the people. Those suspicions, however unfriendly to democracy and however bad they sound in our ears, have truth to them. And the question is how to adapt a government to the task of incorporating those suspicions, those suggestions, at the same time that the people are allowed to have a say in being governed. And the mixed constitutional system that Britain started to have in the mid 18th century and that we've tried to improve on ourselves since then seems about the best answer, which is to say we have a constitution of rights, and the rights override anything that people might want to do against those rights. If somebody feels very strongly that such and such words shouldn't be spoken, but they are not words tending to the overthrow of the government or the subversion of all order in society, we've got the First Amendment. And that overrides the judgment of the majority of the people.
But not of the supermajority.
What?
Not of the supermajority of the people. That is, the First Amendment is only enforced
As long as they keep the
until-
Constitution. Yeah, well, right, the people are capable of destroying their own good. I think that prospect frightened Burke more than it frightens us. But I should say, in honesty, is the good in view for Burke always most prominently the well-being of the people? It's in his mind, and he knows that morally it should be the most important thing, and he instructs himself in this. He almost reminds himself this should be so. But it is true that in Burke, and it gets, the emphasis, the accent of it gets stronger as you go forward in his writings. There is an aesthetic. He has an admiration of the very idea of majestic, long-standing, dignified government as a good in itself, and of an orderly society with subordination of rank, which has implicit but not carried out by force norms of politeness. These things are part of what is the loveliness that makes us able to love our country. And there's that's not in any political sense part of democratic morale. Something different gets into it in Burke. And I think that's a great part of his appeal. It's part of his appeal that many conservatives feel instinctively, and that many what we call liberals distrust reflexively, that you just shouldn't think that way. But the liberals often think that way about individuals too. You just shouldn't think that way, that beauty is a good thing in itself. So he's alien to us in that regard, and that's part of what's driving his way of talking about a government that links the dead, those who are living and those who are to be born. It's not just that the living shouldn't be the judge of themselves. They are under the tribunal that's of humankind of all time, and that's part of it. That's a moral argument. But it's also that the vastness, the, if you will, sublimity of the prospect of human advance over time takes on a greater luster for him when he thinks this is not the arbitrary decision of a majority from moment to moment. It's the same feeling we all have when a town that's been very misguided by innovators destroys its best monuments in order to build some, shopping mall or whatever. At that point, we all turn Burkean. But he enlarges it as a way of explaining what attaches us to society in general, and that's not a democratic feeling, but it's certainly it's part of the Burkean image of society too.
Further questions? How about a question from someone young?
How about from someone angry?
There's one over there.
What do you make of Russell Kirk's take on Burke and the conservative mind?
Back to Harvey Mansfield's question about natural law, which Kirk has something in common with. I think that book was a good counter-statement. Wouldn't be the right way to put it, but it was a good reminder of a body of thought people could draw on that seemed to be neglected for the time being in the 1950s. What was, again, to say it, small c conservative American politics at that time was the Republican business establishment. The Lodge family, the senior Bush family, and so on. The Eastern establishment that Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan demolished in 1964 and after. But that's what counted as conservative, and it wasn't minded. And I think that Kirk was, exerting himself to show there's a mind there if you want to have it. But the I think drawbacks of his table of contents show some of the problem. It can't. Not much of it is American. And the strain of practical-minded politics in it is weak compared to what you could get out of a comparatively liberal work of a few years earlier, like Hofstadter's book, The American Political Tradition, which essentially portrays the Americans as all pragmatists. If you wanted a proper counterstatement to that kind of consensus history, it should have been a little less religiose, a little less shy of having Americans at the front. But that's just a fast summary of how I think one might think about the book. It's a very individual production at a time when it was unfashionable.
Will.
I like to talk a lot. I had a few questions about Burkean politics and Burkean principles. One is, I'm curious what role you see for deliberation in the idea of governing for Burke. Is it simply about confronting injustice? Or at what point in sort of Burke's political vision do you see the House of Commons as a kind of deliberative body? And where does that fit into the sort of principle view?
That's how he sees the House of Commons, as a deliberative body whose the upshot of whose thinking out loud will be enacted into law. I think he is the earliest great proponent of representative government in a form we can recognize, and of deliberative government. I am not alone in this. I mean, Habermas pretty much says it in a footnote of, Theory of the Public Sphere. But that is, how to say it, Burke's idea of normal politics, politics under condition of possible reform, not under condition of necessity, under the pressure of necessity, which he thinks is rare, should not be exaggerated, and we shouldn't seek it out. But at a time of crisis, of absolute necessity, it is not, deliberation is not always possible. And if you were to read as I reread recently, the Letters on a Regicide piece, you might imagine Burke had never been an advocate of deliberative government. But I think that compared to the rest of his writings, those impassioned speeches wanting to pull England into a large-scale war with France and to keep their fight going, they are an exception. They are an aberration. But Burke sees the potential weakness of the deliberative set of mind. The famous sentence about the Chevalier, the spirit of chivalry being gone from France, where he says, I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. That's not deliberation. That's swords leaping from their scabbards. And that's at the moment when she's about to be killed. So deliberation is not good for all climates and at all moments. But he is there to remind us that these are moments. If you don't have a government that is in its essence deliberative, you don't have a government that is answerable to checks. I mean, the two really go together.
So this is where you oppose Tom Paine, then, sort of mandate government, with a Tea Party type government with the enforcement of principles.
Oh, yeah.
As against the deliberativeness.
I have almost Burke's hostility to mandates, but especially to the democratic superstition, along with just sheer lack of imagination and short-term greed that makes American politicians now. It could have been predicted, I guess, believe that there is nothing worse than being defeated in an election. So you must never be seen to go against the pronounced and counted majority view of your constituents. Burke hates that, and he made the sacrifice for it in Bristol in 1780. He 2 visits in 6 years isn't very much. He was a little negligent, and he carried himself pretty high. But the measures he took were not selfish measures for his own party or his own kind of person. They were things that benefited Bristol as well. And I would even say the part of the democratic dogma that insists on mandates is destructive ultimately of representative government for a democracy. Of the representative being someone who has a particular function and knowledge of politics. And it's a prime example of the bad dynamism of democracy that wants to insert itself into every aspect of life, cultural life, personal life, etc. And I think Burke would have seen it beginning with mandates. I'm suspending a lot of reservations because there's much true that could be said on the other side. But I think we can see now all the disadvantages of Paine's team in that argument.
David, we have to stop, but this has been quite remarkable. I think that we've had a speaker here who's not a conservative, I don't think, who described to us the case against democracy. So that's really something. We thank you for that.